So recently I came across a term called safetyism, and right away I was like, what is that? I looked it up, and it turns out it's a concept that, from what I can tell, originates from this book, The Coddling of the American Mind. So I bought the book, I read it, and you guys, this was probably the most important book I've read all of 2024, and I read 100 books this year. I cannot recommend it enough. I put it in my recommended books list on Amazon if you want to check it out below. So today I'm going to be walking you through the main thesis of this book, what I agreed with and what I disagreed with. Because listen, I didn't agree with it 100%, but when you hear what this book is about, if you're not new to this channel, I think it'll start to make a lot of sense why it resonated with me. According to the authors of this book, there are three great untruths that are being spread to America's youth. Number one is the untruth of fragility, that what doesn't kill you makes you weaker. Number two is the untruth of emotional reasoning, that you should always trust your feelings and never question them. And number three is the untruth of us versus them, that life is a battle between good people and evil people. Like I said, if you know what I'm about on this channel, it's probably starting to become clear to you why this book resonated, because resilience, emotional discernment, and combating tribalism are three of the most important things that I talk about. So the author's definition of a great untruth is as follows. Number one, it contradicts ancient wisdom. Number two, it contradicts modern psychological research on well-being. And number three, it harms the individuals and communities who embrace it. Now, I don't think number one is super important. And I say this as somebody who does really value ancient forms of wisdom, who reads Stoicism, who loves to read about pagan traditions. I still don't think that, this is the way people have been saying we should do things for a long time is necessarily an argument that something is true. As for numbers 2 and 3, I honestly feel like the authors could have done a little bit more fleshing out of these in the book. There were a lot of opportunities where they could have drawn more from the research, but instead they used media anecdotes to make their point. But according to the authors, the actual truth of reality is the opposite of these three untruths. Number one, seek out challenges rather than eliminating everything that feels unsafe. Number two, free yourself from cognitive distortions rather than always trusting your initial feelings. And number three, take a generous view of people and look for nuance rather than assuming the worst about people and operating from an us versus them mentality. Overall, I felt that this book was pretty fair and nuanced. It clarified from the beginning that the authors aren't saying they think America's youth have easy, pampered lives these days. Rather, they think that American youth are coming up against what's called problems of progress, bad consequences produced by otherwise good social changes. This book is kind of like what I think Abigail Shrier was trying to go for with her book Bad Therapy, except this one was actually good. Instead of cherry-picking the data, the authors acknowledged when something didn't fit their narrative, for the most part, more on that in a second. Instead of finding a scapegoat to blame for all these problems analyzed throughout the book, like how Shrier used therapists as the scapegoat, they presented a more balanced explanation of why these untruths have come up in their opinion. So from my perspective, this was a lot more of a nuanced book. Let's dive into each of the three untruths. Number one, the untruth of fragility. What doesn't kill you makes you weaker. So the authors start by making a case for why exposing ourselves to stressors doesn't make us weaker. They talk about the realization a couple decades ago that kids avoiding peanuts in case they have a peanut allergy was actually exacerbating the rate of peanut allergies and the rate of severe peanut allergies. They also talk about the hygiene hypothesis, which shows that allergy rates go up as countries get wealthier and cleaner because our immune systems in wealthier countries are not as exposed to bacteria, and therefore our immune system doesn't really know how to combat them. This concept that we need low doses of stress in order to get stronger is the same concept behind vaccinations, behind growing your muscles, exposing yourself to anxiety-inducing situations. And the authors talk about a concept called anti-fragility, which is from a different book that I will also be reading. According to that author, there are three kinds of things in life. One category is the fragile type of thing. Things like teacups, which break easily, they can't heal themselves, and they have to be handled gently. The second kind of thing is resilient, like a plastic cup. It can survive shocks. And the third type of thing is anti-fragile. Things like people, muscles, and bones are anti-fragile. They require stressors and challenges in order to learn and adapt and grow. This is why moderate amounts of stress is actually better for you than low amounts of stress. The book, The Upside of Stress, talked all about that. I will link my video on that book up here. But the authors of this current book argue that kids and people in general are naturally anti-fragile, and if you coddle them, they lose their power. Now, there's a slight caveat here where I disagree with them. I agree that adults as a whole are anti-fragile, that we have an immense capacity to repair ourselves after stress and to even come back stronger. But kids are actually a lot more vulnerable than adults. It's why we have different laws around child abuse versus abuse against a fellow adult, because children are in a lot of ways helpless and dependent. And what happens in childhood largely sets the stage for the rest of that child's life. Now, I think we're always able to turn around the circumstances of our life as adults. We're not doomed to live a certain way just because something happened in our childhoods. But children are sponges, so those early experiences can have really dire consequences further down the line. It's only once those kids have a fully cooked prefrontal cortex and all of the capabilities for emotion regulation and resilience at their disposal that they turn into anti-fragile adults. I actually do think that children are more in the resilient category than the anti-fragile category. Something else that the authors talk about is this concept, safetyism, which is the idea that in American culture, people have started using "I don't feel safe" as justification for avoiding certain stressors. The authors say that safety originally referred to physical safety, like freedom from injury, from bodily harm, and that due to concept creep, now safety has encompassed emotional safety as well, and that certain people conflate emotional safety with the absence of painful feelings. Now, here's where my feelings on this start to get a little bit conflicted. My definition of safety is the absence of harm. Physical harm is not the only type of harm out there. It's why a lot of abuse victims will tell you that some of the most enduring consequences of their abuse was mental or emotional rather than the bruises that eventually faded. It's also why red flags of intimate partner violence must include non-physical signs. For example, at my doctor the other day, there was a poster trying to raise awareness of intimate partner violence, and it had certain categories going from green, yellow to red. And it starts out with small things like your partner constantly criticizing you, belittling you in front of people, controlling your whereabouts. And then it starts to get more in the red zone with obviously like flat out physical abuse. But there are absolutely non-physical ways to harm another person, and that harm can have long-lasting, profound effects, right? Like when we think about what does physical harm mean, my definition is physical harm is something that leaves some sort of scar. You know, like if somebody accidentally bumps into you, doesn't leave a bruise, doesn't hurt you really badly, doesn't break your bone, I wouldn't call that necessarily like physical harm. It was a small interaction, but it didn't leave a scar. And I think the same is true for emotional harm as well. There are certain things that we come up against in day-to-day life that are hurtful, or maybe inconvenient, or uncomfortable, but they don't necessarily leave a scar. They don't necessarily have these long-lasting negative effects on us. That I don't think is necessarily emotional harm. That is just the experience of going through life. However, there are examples of how even something that might seem minor on the surface, like chronic invalidation, can cause a lot of harm. So let me first define invalidation using the Marsha Linehan definition, the creator of TPT. The rejection, dismissal, or negation of a person's thoughts, feelings, or experiences when someone's emotional responses are not acknowledged as understandable or acceptable within their context. So this could include things like minimizing emotions, like saying you're overreacting. It could include dismissing someone's thoughts, like saying that's not important. It could include mocking or criticizing someone's feelings, like saying you're being ridiculous, or denying the reality of someone's experience, like saying that's not true, you're imagining things, you misremembered. And the effects of chronic invalidation include emotional dysregulation, possibly developing borderline personality disorder if this chronic invalidation happens when you're a child. Chronic invalidation has also been linked to depression, anxiety, PTSD, eating disorders, non-suicidal self-injury, suicidal ideation, interpersonal difficulties. Let's use another example. Parents who don't soothe their babies when they're crying. That can lead to chronically elevated cortisol levels, which is associated with health issues, inadequate physical and mental development, immune problems, sleep issues, an inability for the baby to then go on to know how to soothe themselves as adults, insecure attachment, interestingly, a sense of being unsafe in the world, which leads to a state of hypervigilance, reduced empathy, increased aggression and emotional reactivity, learned helplessness, depression, anxiety, and low self-esteem. So even when we're talking about like tiny seeming harm, in certain situations, if it's done chronically, and particularly if it's done to vulnerable adults, that can result in really long-lasting harm. And that is a perfect parallel for what happens with physical harm too. Typically, if someone bumps into you gently, it's not going to hurt you. But if you are vulnerable, such as if you already have an open wound there, then it might hurt you. Or if it's done chronically and they continue to bump into you day in and day out until eventually it starts to bruise and never heal, then that can turn into a long-term injury. And you know what I caught in this book? Even the authors themselves understand that safety extends to more than just the physical, because per their own definition of what makes an untruth, what was number 3? It harms the individuals and communities who embrace it. There they are, using the word harm, presumably in a non-physical way. So I think the last thing we need is to regress back into the mindset that you cannot harm a person unless you're using your fists. Research has established time and time again that people are indeed harmed in non-physical ways when it comes to abuse and neglect, that they experience profound negative consequences as a result of being emotionally unsafe with other people. But here's where I do agree with the authors of this book. I think a lot of people have taken the phrase, "I don't feel safe," too far these days. Just because something causes you a painful emotion like discomfort, anxiety, sadness, it does not mean that it's necessarily going to cripple you in the long term. Let's say, for instance, that you even have a panic attack because of a trigger that you experienced. That panic attack will not kill you. It will not traumatize you in most cases. It will be a deeply, deeply distressing moment, but it does not necessarily need to leave you a weaker version of yourself. It was just a temporary moment of extreme pain. And we live in an era of such emotional avoidance where bad emotions or painful emotions are considered silent killers. But the reality is that non-physical harm only occurs in extreme cases, just like physical harm does. Most of the time we can move through life assuming that we're not going to be physically injured, just like most of the time we can move through life assuming we're not going to be emotionally injured. When people take safetyism too far, they take a phenomenon that happens in a very extreme, rare situation, and they generalize it to much milder forms, to very mild forms of stress. Just like someone accidentally brushing against you on accident does not constitute physical harm, coming into contact with an opinion that challenges your worldview does not constitute emotional harm. Just like a needle puncturing your skin when you're getting blood drawn at the doctor does not constitute physical harm. Neither is getting your feelings hurt one time. When harm does happen, it's usually when an individual is highly vulnerable, such as a child, an elder, someone with some sort of disability, and when something extremely stressful has happened or something moderately stressful has happened over and over and over again, very chronically over time, like being belittled for years during your crucial period of development. And there's a big difference between feeling unsafe and feeling uncomfortable. I do a lot of things every single day that make me uncomfortable. I go out to the store and I go to the doctor and I try to communicate with people in a language I don't feel very comfortable in, and people don't always react the best. I sometimes spend time with people whose presence makes me nervous for different reasons. I post videos on here to have 1 million people and get dissected every single day. Earlier this year, I moved halfway across the world. Doing things that make us feel uncomfortable is crucial to functioning as an adult. If you're always in your comfort zone, then you are most certainly not exposing yourself to the moderate amounts of stress that are going to help you get stronger in the long run. And unfortunately, I've also seen people weaponize the "I don't feel safe" phrase to mean, "This event makes me feel anxious, so I refuse to go. This person disagrees with something I believe in, so I don't think they even have a right to speak." And sometimes even, "I don't get a good feeling about this person, not based on anything they've done, just because I have a feeling. So I'm going to assume they're an evil person and stay away from them at all costs." And it can be pretty hurtful to be on the receiving end of this. Like, if your friend says they don't feel safe at your birthday party because there are going to be too many people there, it might make you feel on some level like you're somehow creating a hostile environment. Or if somebody says they don't feel safe talking to you, it kind of frames you as some sort of like danger aggressor, some sort of predator that would cause them harm. When someone says they don't feel safe, it automatically positions them as the victim and the other person as an aggressor of sorts. And if no serious harm is actually being done to the purported victim, then the real injustice in that situation is against the person who they're claiming to need protection from. Now, the authors bring up that offensive speech is becoming increasingly medicalized on college campuses. That but students say getting triggered is jeopardizing their mental health and making them feel unsafe. And up until recently, the authors say that students wanted to block people they thought were espousing evil ideas, but the way they went about it wasn't by claiming that they would be harmed by the exposure to those ideas. This is a newly popular idea, this idea that speech can be violence. I do agree with the authors that speech is not the same thing as violence. If you don't like what someone has to say, then point out the errors with their argument. You can't just shut down speech you don't like, because if you can do that, then somebody can also do it to you. I don't think that's a world any of us want to live in. And I also don't think we need to hyperbolize and exaggerate how much harm somebody is causing to make ourselves seem like more of a victim. You know, something that you'll hear a lot these days is people saying, "You don't support my right to exist." That's very rare cases where somebody genuinely doesn't think that you, because of an identity you hold, don't deserve to exist. Most of the times they're just disagreeing with you about something you have an opinion on. And the issue with framing words as violence is that it allows people to justify actual acts of violence as self-defense. And then even people who are kind of neutral in these situations are viewed as being on the side of violence. And so even those people can find themselves on the receiving end sometimes of actual violence that's supposedly self-defense. And this book gives some really poignant and concerning examples of this happening on college campuses. I don't have time to go into all of them here, so again, I highly recommend that you pick up this book and read it for yourself, because it's incredibly dense with insights. Let me wrap up the discussion around safetyism with this. Post-traumatic growth is more common than post-traumatic stress disorder. And even for those who have PTSD, who have long-term issues because of their trauma, who feel like they are maybe worse off than they were before the trauma happened, they also have the natural capability and resilience to come out stronger on the other side eventually. So in my opinion, harm absolutely can be emotional, but that does not mean that it can't be overcome. And the point is not to completely insulate ourselves from harm as we move through the world, but rather to trust that we will be able to handle anything that comes our way, even being harmed. The authors also touch on trigger warnings, how they're pretty counter-therapeutic according to standard ways of treating things like anxiety and trauma, that the avoidance of triggers is actually a symptom of PTSD rather than the treatment of it. I actually just did an in-depth video on a recent meta-analysis showing that trigger warnings are not effective in protecting the people they're supposed to protect. I'll put that up here if you want to give it a watch. And I got a lot of feedback, and it's interesting to me that a lot of the feedback is, well, trigger warnings work for me because I get to avoid topics that I don't want to go into. Because again, the findings of the meta-analysis said that trigger warnings do not cause people to avoid triggering content. In fact, the more vulnerable the person, the more severe their trauma, the more it actually increases their engagement with the content. Trigger warnings also don't help people cope ahead for the triggering content, and they increase anticipatory anxiety. So I understand and respect everyone's lived experience that trigger warnings personally help me not engage with things that I don't have the bandwidth for, but that frankly does not change the results of the meta-analysis that I shared in that video. The research can't possibly speak for everyone's experience. It speaks for overall statistically significant trends. So that was all about untruth number 1, the untruth of fragility. Moving on to untruth number 2, the untruth of emotional reasoning. Always trust your feelings. So I actually also just did a deep dive on this concept in my video, Are All Feelings Valid? The TLDR is this. Feelings are always a good source of information. They're never something to avoid, they're never something to judge yourself for, but also they don't always fit the facts of the situation. When we assume that they always fit the facts of the situation, we're falling into the cognitive error of what's called emotional reasoning. Now, the authors of this book argue that a lot of today's issues are caused by cognitive distortions such as emotional reasoning, catastrophizing, overgeneralizing, black and white thinking, mind reading, labeling, negative filtering, discounting the positives, blaming. And while I agree with this, I did disagree with how the authors kind of seem to paint CBT as the one and only solution to mental health issues or to a culture of safetyism. Listen, I did a lot of CBT both as therapist and client when I was overcoming my own issues, and those skills didn't take me very far. What truly helped me heal was depth-oriented, insight-focused work. Because listen, sometimes CBT does assume that people are distorting the facts of the situation even when they're not. It kind of operates under the assumption that if you have mental health issues, there's a good chance that there's some sort of distortion at play. But let's take, for example, the person who's depressed because they just lost their job. CBT might encourage them to think, well, you're catastrophizing by assuming that you're going to end up homeless because of this. But what if that's actually true? So many Americans live one paycheck away from homelessness. So it's not really catastrophizing, is it? To be clear, I'm not discounting CBT as a treatment modality. I think it's wonderfully helpful for some people, and it's got a big body of research behind it. What I take issue with is how the authors framed it as kind of the one and only simple solution to these issues, because there are a lot of people out there who have gone through CBT, who understand that their thoughts might be distorted, but that doesn't change their emotional experience because there's something deeper at play that's going unaddressed. The authors also touch on microaggressions, these tiny little interactions in day-to-day life where one person feels like the other person is being bigoted against them. And they talk about the idea of impact over intent. Now, I've heard this phrase a lot from my peers in the psychology field, and for a while I agreed with it, that the impact of your words matters more than the intent with which you spoke them. And the reason I agreed with this for a long time is that when people say, I didn't mean to hurt you, that wasn't my intention, when they're apologizing for causing someone harm, it's kind of a cop-out. That's not really relevant. It doesn't really have a place in an apology when you've caused someone serious harm. However, I always had an inkling in the back of my mind that intent does matter though, because if you think about it, imagine that somebody's playing basketball down the street from you and they accidentally throw their ball at you and it hits you in the leg or something. Is that the same thing as somebody hurling a basketball with the intention of hurting you? No, I don't think those are the same thing at all. I think I would much rather be hurt by someone who didn't mean to hurt me. And the authors say that unfortunately identifying microaggressions, which a lot of college students are taught to do during orientation, for instance, often just accomplishes instructing people how to operate on cognitive distortions. For example, let's say that you are a bride at your bridal shower and somebody gives you a food blender as the present. And you're not quite sure if it's a microaggression because of a sexist stereotype that you now have to cook for your husband. If you were to use emotional reasoning, you would say, I feel like this person might be sexist, even though I have no real evidence of it, just this food blender that they gave me. Therefore, this person is probably sexist. If you're using overgeneralizing, you might say, they did this one thing, they gave me a food blender, so that must point to a pattern of sexism. If you're using black and white thinking, you might say either they're sexist or they're actively fighting sexism, and since they're not actively fighting sexism with this gift, then they're sexist. If you're using mind reading, you would say, they must have gotten me this blender because they think a woman needs to cook for her husband and belongs in the kitchen. If they're using negative filtering, they might say, it doesn't matter that they've always been kind and respectful to me because this one thing is sexist. And if they're blaming the other person, they would say, I feel angry now and it's their fault. So the authors claim that this culture of identifying microaggressions encourages to assume the worst of other people and disregard their true intentions because, well, you made me feel this way, so your intention doesn't matter. And I do think that oftentimes what is interpreted as microaggressions can just be a misunderstanding or a miscommunication between people. And we can get into really hot waters when we assume the worst of intentions of people rather than just clarifying, hey, what did you mean by this? Help me understand, and just approach it from a place of curiosity. Typically in court, the authors talk about how intentionality is crucial to determining guilt. They say if Bob tries to poison Maria and he fails, he has committed a serious crime even though it has no impact on Maria. But if Maria accidentally kills Bob by consensually kissing him after eating a peanut butter sandwich, she has committed no offense. This reminds me of the scar experiment, where women were given prosthetic scars by makeup artists and told to go interact with people. But before they went back out into the real world, the makeup artists took away their scar prosthetics, so they weren't wearing their scars anymore. And the participants actually perceived higher amounts of discrimination about what they assumed were their scars. So this was a really crucial study in self-fulfilling prophecies and also expectancy effects, the idea that our beliefs and our assumptions influence our interpretation of reality. When we assume everyone is out to be offensive, that's the world we create in our minds, and it can lead to a lot of misunderstandings and hypervigilance. And untruth number 3, the untruth of us versus them. Life is a battle between good and evil people. So the authors go through some absolutely mind-blowing examples of how people framed professors as evil oppressors for very minor infractions. Now, caveat here, I wasn't familiar with the vast majority of these cases. So I don't know if the authors gave the full picture of what happened in these situations, but if the situations really went down the way that they claim it, it is just bonkers that these things happened. They talk about how tribalism causes us to have a lot of empathy for our in-group and to devalue the out-group, something that I talk about a lot on this channel. And here I actually thought that the authors could have pulled even more from the research on this topic, because there is a wealth of research showing that human beings don't feel much empathy for those who belong to a different group than them. Even when it comes to really superficial things, like one person is rooting for a different team in a sport. But they did touch on some of the dangers of training students to see everyone as members of distinct separate groups, and how when we split ourselves into us versus them, we're unfortunately setting ourselves up for selective empathy. The solution, as they frame it, is common humanity identity politics, which appeals to shared morals and unifying language. MLK, for instance, used a lot of common humanity identity politics in his rhetoric, focusing on uniting people rather than dividing them. This is in great contrast to the common enemy identity politics, which identifies a common enemy that glues the in-group, such as what happened in the Third Reich. And the authors also criticize some of the interpretations and applications of intersectionality theory. There was one image they showed of how, per intersectionality theory, basically all your different identities get split up into either privileged or oppressed, victim or oppressor. And when I saw that diagram, I was like, yeah, it kind of seems like intersectionality is an amplification of viewing yourself as victim or oppressor in a variety of categories. But listen, I did my dissertation from an intersectional lens, and I've never come across a diagram like that one. I'm not sure that it's really a good definition of what intersectionality is. And the authors were fair, I think, in acknowledging that Kimberly Crenshaw's theory of intersectionality, in its fundamental original sense, holds a lot of value. That they just think some people are using this theory for creating more divisiveness rather than nuance. And I agree that there's a lot of value in Crenshaw's original proposition. The way I see it, intersectionality is a lot less about splitting the world into different types of victim and oppressor, and more about acknowledging the importance of context and considering multiple variables when looking at an individual's experience. However, I have also seen in recent years intersectionality get kind of weaponized by people who would use it to split the world into even tinier and tinier groups of us versus them. You know, like even within feminist circles, even within queer circles, there's very much a tendency right now for people to speak at other groups within that umbrella group and say, well, you don't know my exact experience, so you can't speak for me. I actually don't claim you as part of this overall umbrella. The authors also touch on call-out culture, which they say requires constant vigilance, fear, and censorship, and they talk about witch hunts, and how a lot of what's happening on college campuses these days with call-out culture has the same components as witch hunts. They arise quickly, they include crimes against the collective, charges are often trivial or fabricated, and there's a fear of defending the accused. And something else that I thought was really interesting from the book was the authors talked about the dangers of merging research with politics, as has been happening in the humanities for a lot of years. They say every single researcher is vulnerable to confirmation bias. So peer review exists to offset this very human vulnerability that we all have. And it's a process called institutionalized disconfirmation, where researchers try to get closer and closer to what is the truth by disconfirming others' studies and providing fresh perspectives. The authors say, but what would happen to a university or an academic field if everyone were on the same team and everyone shared the same confirmation bias? The disconfirmation process would break down. Research shows that reviewers go easy on articles and grant proposals that support their political team, and they are more critical of articles and proposals that contradict their team's values or beliefs. The authors point out how the humanities have always leaned left, and that's not an issue necessarily, except that now the left-to-right politics ratio in academia is 5-to-1 rather than what it used to be, which was 2-to-1, which means that politics and research in these contexts have all but merged, and the disconfirmation process is kind of compromised. So how did we get here? The authors propose a few explanations: the rise in political polarization, increased levels of teen anxiety and depression, overprotective parenting practices, the growth of campus bureaucracy, and a passion for justice in response to major news events. I found all of these explanations moderately compelling, but I don't know, I just felt like something was missing. I can't quite put my finger on it, so if you have a theory of like one possible explanation that you think is not included in this list, Jot it down below. And the authors also offer some advice for raising wiser kids and improving school culture. Most of which I thought was pretty good, but again, not life-changing advice, and I think that's just because there's only so much that one individual can do in the face of an entire culture. Before I wrap up and summarize today, I'd like to take the time to respond to a comment I got when I mentioned I'd be reviewing this book. So this person's talking about how they hope I would also talk about how this book misrepresented some things. For example, they quote a study where 58% of students said it's important to be part of a campus community where I'm not exposed to intolerant and offensive ideas, but leave out that in the same study, 92% of students agreed that it's important to be part of a campus community where I'm exposed to the opinions and ideas of other students, even if they're different from my own. Also, conveniently omitting Amy Wax and other faculty members' racist and dehumanizing statements from the book that led to the backlash they received. So as for point number 1 with omitting the 92% statistic, I don't necessarily see that as cherry picking. I do think they should have mentioned it as well if they wanted to really be fair. But this distinction between I don't want to be part of a community where I'm exposed to intolerant or offensive ideas versus I want to be exposed to different opinions than my own, it kind of brings up the question, well, where do we draw the line between different opinions and intolerant or offensive ideas? Because having been in higher education for nearly a decade of my life, I can tell you that students' definitions of what's considered intolerant or offensive is becoming increasingly wide. And look, I can't possibly fact check every single source in this book. There are 50 pages worth of citations in here and they're in like 9-point font. Typically, I check a source for something when it sounds inconsistent with my knowledge of what the research consensus is. And as far as I could tell, the discussion of these 3 great untruths was congruent with what I learned in my psychology studies. Like I said, if anything, I felt like they could have gone deeper into how the research supports their claims. Now, as for your point number 2, I'm not familiar with the details of every single case that they mentioned in the book, and I looked up this Amy Wax person, and it looks like you're right that she said some racist things. And if the authors made it a habit to sweep such details under the rug in their writing of this book, then that does make me think they could have done a better job of presenting the truth in a more nuanced, fair way. But like I said, I'm not an expert in a lot of these news stories that I read about, and so from where I'm sitting, I felt like they did a pretty good job featuring news stories from both the left and the right of presenting us with the details of what happened in these cases. So I don't know, maybe I'm just missing something here. Maybe I'm just ignorant about this. Final thoughts. The 3 great untruths being spread across the US, particularly in college campuses, are a real problem, in my opinion, and I agree with the author's arguments on this. We need young Americans to understand that, first of all, they are not fragile and they do not need to run away from stress or painful emotions. Assuming your emotions always fit the facts is probably not a good idea, and the world is not a black and white place split up between victims and oppressors. We need to lean into common humanity identity politics rather than further dividing ourselves. Regarding the concept of safetyism, I disagree that the word safety shouldn't extend to the emotional realm as well. The authors disregarded a massive body of research when it comes to showing that harm does extend past the physical, but I do also agree that some people these days weaponize the phrase "I don't feel safe" in order to shut down discussion or to shelter themselves from painful emotions, and I don't think that's healthy. Feeling painful emotions is not the same as experiencing harm. I agree that we need to reassess trigger warnings, microaggression trainings, and call-out culture within the context of what the research says, which is that none of these things are conducive to a healthier environment. So all in all, I give this book 5 out of 5 stars. I strongly recommend it to any of you guys watching. Thank you for taking the time to hear my perspective, especially if you've watched this far into the video. I really appreciate that you value my opinion, but at the same time, you should decide for yourself what you think about the book. So let me know if you do end up reading it. I hope you take care, and I'll see you soon.